Hello, my name is JP Kuehlwein, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of the Off the Shelf Book Podcast, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I will be talking to James Richardson about his new book, Ramping Your Brand: How to Write the Killer CPG Growth Curve. Thanks for joining us today, James.
Thank you, JP. Pleasure to be here.
James holds a PhD in cultural anthropology. He is a strategy consultant and expert when it comes to consumer packaged goods, or CPG, and particularly when it comes to the food sector and innovations that are happening within the sector, or maybe not innovations. We'll talk about that. Just think about Greek yogurt, kefir, kale, or kombucha. He declared his goal to be to democratize access to best practices in early stage of brand growth, hence the name of his firm, which is Premium Growth Strategy, or PGS. He says that big food has taught him a lot about how to grow or not in that sector, and he thinks they should not have a monopoly on it. So in that spirit, he has published a book on how to grow your brand. It's entitled Ramp Your Brand, and ramping is an important concept in it. The subtitle is How to Write the Killer CPG Growth Curve. So there is a lot of promise in that title. And that is what we're going to talk about for the next 25 minutes or so. Thanks again, James, for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Hey, before we start ramping our brands here, you are an anthropologist. I found that quite intriguing. You have an interesting story about almost getting killed in South India a couple of times at the beginning of your book, and maybe some connections you're making between, studying the culture of South India and then the takeoff curves of Icelandic yogurts or kale chips.
Thanks, JP. So yeah, it does. When you ask the question that way, it sounds like an odd connection indeed. But this is how and it took me a while to see the value of that experience, to be honest with you. But what I have distilled, I think, looking back on things, is that my field work in Southern India, because it was such an extreme form of culture shock and very different society and set of cultural rules, it made me, I think, extremely aware of the importance of the power of managing social impressions, which is almost a medieval art form in India. They take it very seriously. And secondly, the importance of not assuming that a stated aspiration from a human being is something they actually care about, and making sure you look for additional evidence from that person to suggest that the value they're claiming that they have is actually embedded in their behavior. And if we take it to consumer packaged goods, it's the difference between what people say to you on a survey or privately at a coffee shop, where they are actually performing who they are to you, versus what's in their pantry, which is the archaeological sort of residue of their actual habits and desires. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It reminds me of a couple of phrases that we learned at Procter & Gamble, or that the CEO emphasized, which is, execution is the only strategy you see, and behavior, i.e. purchase, is the only proof that it works. Everything else is theory, I guess.
Yep. It's a guess. Everything else is a guess.
Now, your book's subtitle is Writing the Killer CPG Growth Curve. And we should mention that was published before the COVID crisis. It implies that, there is a lot of growth to be had. So my question is, isn't CPG, particularly food, already pretty saturated? Where can you find killer growth in such a mature category?
I think that's a totally valid question. And I think it really has to do with what your standards for scale are at the end of that growth curve, if that makes sense. So, where the explosive growth has happened and is still happening is basically between 10 and $100 million in POS sales, roughly speaking. And that's where my book really focuses its energies. And in that range, and I'll be honest, that's not a range that a brand manager at a big company spends any time thinking about, because they're not a brand manager of something that's small. So, even if the company owns a business that's small, and like if you go to ConAgra, you'll see a bunch of, there's a long tail of sub $100 million brands, but they aren't actively managed. So I think it has to do with your ability to understand the kind of growth in early stage that then tends to have led historically to continued double-digit growth up through $500 million towards $1 billion, if that makes sense. But if your definition of scale of a satisfactory scale achievement is automatically $1 billion in trailing sales every year, and I think we all know companies that think like that internally. If that's your standard, don't read my book because you'll be super bored. But the reality, so is there a massive opportunity to create $5 and $10 billion new brands? I don't see that myself. But the thing is, for those who are able to work the private equity markets as an investor, as a public investor, or directly, or for entrepreneurs, there is an enormous amount of growth and monetization from $10 million to $500 million. And there are brands that have, Perfect Bar is one of the best examples recently, where there was a slow exponential growth curve, which is the curve that I talk about in my book. I call it the skate ramp. And, Mondelez got a minority position, then they took it over, and now it's like a $400 million business. I think Perfect Bar could continue to progress nicely towards $1 billion snack brand. It's got all the DNA for that. Are those opportunities common? No, but there are principles you can learn so that you create an innovation that's better set up to do that. I hope that answers the question that you had.
And it seems like there is a transition. I mean, RX Bar is another related example that comes to my mind, and Kellogg buying that up. So is the model then that small entrepreneurs found these things, they bring it up to maybe $70 million or so, and then if it looks scalable, it gets acquired, gobbled up, and is scaled? Is that now the typical model, or maybe it has always been? At least as far as
that
food
is
concerned?
becoming. Yeah, I think all the stakeholders who drive the capital investment, that's where they are now looking that small. Whereas 10 years ago, that was considered insane, and it was only very progressive people who were doing that.
Gotcha. There is a dichotomy here, a conflicting information that I get when it comes to startups and entrepreneurship. On the one hand, there is this incredible excitement, and there seems to be a founder myth where founders are being showcased everywhere in magazines and the media and discussions and celebrated. On the other hand, there are lots of statistics, hard data from like the Small Business Administration or from Inc. magazine and so on, that suggests that actually there are less companies being founded, there are less new products surviving in the market than a couple of decades ago. What is it now? Is there a very fruitful and active founder scene out there and a proliferation of new products? Or are we fooling ourselves and actually there's huge concentration going on in ever less brands and businesses?
I think I'm not going to dispute the numbers from the SBA, but I think that, like I say, in CPG, there are, on a percentage basis, there's fewer companies, I think, now that are getting through that, what I call the death funnel, which is ridiculously low in trailing revenue. It's literally $1 million out of the register. Fewer and fewer are getting through that, I think. because there's a lot. It's just been a ton of people in natural organic food and beverage starting companies due to, honestly, it has less to do with private equity money than it has to do with the phenomenal growth and the availability of angel and family office capital, because those are the people who are actually driving companies through that death funnel and getting them up to $10 million. So in my sector, I think it's actually more people starting. And it's just actually harder and more crowded to get to that initial revenue threshold where you're going to actually start to be building a brand, because you're not really building a brand before $10 million. You're just selling product. Hopefully you're selling it well. So that's at least my perspective. So in a sense, I think you're right and wrong. I mean, I think that survivability long term is probably lower now.
Got you.
But remember, the average small business founder, even in my industry, they're not as ambitious, perhaps, as we're thinking in this conversation. So if they max out at a $15 million steady business, and there are many of those, they're actually quite happy with themselves, as long as they're paying.
Gotcha. So let's get to the specifics of how to ride that killer wave, as you call it. In your book, you have 4 parts to your particular approach. Thinking about that CPG growth curve for entrepreneurs. Can you describe that process overall first for us, and how these parts fit together and yield success?
Yeah, absolutely. So the key metaphor of the book is what I call the skate ramp. It's and you'll see it at all major skate parks in the United States. It is, the lower half of the S curve they teach you in business school. It's an exponential curve, a nonlinear curve. And the key is that you have exponential growth off a small base. And the power of that curve is that it prevents wild overdistribution of the product, if you do it right. And what I call premature scaling, which tends to fail as often as a bad line extension at P&G. So, and it also prevents what I just alluded to, which was kind of that 7-figure to 8-figure stagnation, which is very common, where people hit 10, 15 million and then the growth stops. So it's the curve you want to be on, because if you're growing exponentially off a small base of, say, $250,000, $500,000 on your books, after 5, 6, 7 years, you're going to start to really hum. You will come from out of nowhere, and by the time that anybody can react, because they've all written you off due to scale, by the time they can react, you're just exploding. It's what's happening to Spindrift right now. So that's basically the major theme. Is it's a path that is growing fast enough, but not too fast. And you have to understand that I work in a world that in the last 10 years, there's just been so much private equity and so much venture capital thrown at this sector. And every day I read new media announcements of people who are, I just launched in Walmart instantaneously, 4,500 stores. Nobody knows my product. They never heard of my brand, but I'm going to do great. Yeah, I don't have a lot of case studies of that turning out well, by the way. So the temptation's there, because the capital to do those launches exists today. 30 years ago, Annie's didn't have access to that money, right? There was nobody to give it to them. Right. So that's the primary thing.
That's very interesting. Wolf Schaefer and myself, we've studied and written a book about what we call the rethinking of prestige branding. And to us, this new prestige is basically anyone who's able to demand a significant premium over the market average, multiple X's the average. Yep. And we didn't approach it from a supply chain or demand curve side. We approach it from a branding side. What does it take for the brand to build up properly, to become seductive and irresistible and peerless, if you like, in the mind of consumers? And we did find that same exponential growth curve to be common when you look across these brands, whether it's Patagonia, Nespresso, or Red Bull. There is another commonality, which is you also conclude that these brands should be premium priced. Can you talk to us about why you come to that conclusion?
So there's two major reasons. One is financial, because the book was written for undercapitalized companies, and believe it or not, even if you get a Series A of 5 million, you're undercapitalized compared to General Mills. So that's the audience. And premium pricing, and you understand this, JP. I mean, once you're a general manager and your bonus is tied to your P&L, right? Then you start to get awfully attuned to the unit economics of CPG, and the unit economics of CPG are pretty bad at a penny per unit, right? So the only way you traditionally make money, especially in a mass market product, is just selling an ungodly volume of it. And then that basically accumulates up into $1 billion when you sell 1 billion, 2 billion units a year. But that's not the world that entrepreneurs can play in. That's not a tier that they can play in. So if they have to launch at a premium price because they need gross penny profit to basically keep the lights on, to eat. And if they don't have that, they end up having to raise money prematurely, and usually the whole thing unwinds really fast. So that's the first reason. It's just business sense. You need gross penny profit to fund operations, to do some basic marketing, yada, yada. Mind you, I'm not talking about paying yourself anything, if at all, but that's a separate issue. So the second issue, I think, is where the book focuses more of its time on, and that is when you have a premium price, or like you're saying, a prestige brand, essentially through premium pricing. There's two things that happen. First of all, social psychologists have already published academic research. I think some marketers are aware of it, that has proven fairly well that a premium price at the shelf versus the category average that's apparent to the consumer confers a notion irrationally of higher quality. It could be nonsense, but they generally believe it. And so that's powerful. But it's powerful because it creates a different marketing funnel than a big brand manager is used to managing with a commodity business or a market leading business. And that funnel can consist, if the product is designed well, it can consist of a higher purchase and what we would call a stronger purchase intent trial consumer base. So the people coming into the funnel have a much higher, much stronger purchase intent because the price is a barrier to sloppy purchasing, if that makes sense. So if you've got a premium price that's asking, it's like, whoa, it's 100% more than the unit average, the category unit average. You definitely have to. It's going to cause almost anybody to think, "Oh, why am I doing this?" Now that thought process is not often conscious, JP. It's unconscious. That's the beauty of it. It's very cultural and symbolic, but it will happen. People's brains will start to process. Why does this matter to me? What does it even mean? Why would I care? And why in God's name would I pay this much? And it's all happening really fast. But what it does is initially it shuts out what I call the wrong consumer, which is the person who just, they just wanted something in that category. And they saw you. They don't really care what you're about. They didn't read the package too closely. So it gets rid of them because they'll see the price and be like, what the hell? And move on. Whereas it selects for people who get what you are symbolically communicating on the package as your point of difference. And that will be a person who will happily pay the premium. I call it leads to this phenomena where you're essentially taxing your early adopters happily, right? Because they have a lot of value. They place a lot of cultural meaning in what you're doing. They will pay that crazy premium. They are generating cash on your books. They are funding the launch of your thing. And that is a relationship you want to create very early on if you want to ride this ramp. You need the kind of crazy people who will pay that premium because they're your marketing team, JP. That's what I believe.
Interesting. Interesting. I mean, again,
They're your
I
free
see,
marketing team.
yeah, I see strong parallels. We have a concept in our book. We call them the Uber target, based on Nietzsche.
Yeah.
It's a long story. The Uber target. So the target, the people that go above and beyond for you, and they're the major spreaders of word of mouth. They're your disciples. They're the people who kind of kill for your brand. They're the ones that wear your tattoo. But we also talk about how you need to deliver for them. You need to deliver on a material basis, i.e., the product cannot disappoint in what it promises. And of course, in the meaningfulness, it needs to be whatever its function is, whether it's that social badge or it is that expression of sophistication or of being fit or being sexy or whatever it is. If we bring this to your category here, foods, how do you make sure that a product delivers on this premiumness? Like, is it any odd kale chip or, chickpea hummus?
No. So I think the challenge is that, and I spend a third of my book talking about it because it's really thorny. You need you need an attribute outcome signal. Um, to talk like a cultural anthropologist, you need a symbolic signal between a leading attribute that's defensible in your innovation, and it probably should be very clearly communicated on the package, front panel, and a end outcome of using the product, which is obviously relevant to that category, but which you, without making any rational argument to the consumer, that they will intuitively, after using it, say, oh yeah, this is so much better than the crap I was having before. And that's often how they'll talk in an interview. Oh, I found, I can't believe the crap I used to have instead of this, right? So, and that's the kind of moral juxtaposition you want to create. And the more extreme that is, the more potential you probably have. And the more explosively your velocities will be relative to the category. So I hope that makes sense.
Does this in food also go beyond the taste? I.e., if I like a certain drink, if I like a certain snack, it is not only because of the taste, or maybe even it tastes like crap, like Red Bull, but it is because of the belief, the meaning that is injected, i.e., giving me wings, become a superhuman. Does it
Yeah,
work like that?
I think I don't want to oversell the tagline for Red Bull, although I do point to it with clients. Um, you know, the outcome, and that's the language that I use. I think most marketers call it, just say benefit or need state. It doesn't really matter what you call it, but the outcome that matters is one that's relevant to the category culturally, and that you don't control that as a marketer. You need to pick from what's relevant, right? But there's usually multiple things, and you need to modernize the
Interesting.
approach to a certain
Interesting.
outcome. You need to modernize the approach to the outcome, but the modernization could be completely irrational, as you just alluded. It doesn't have to make any fucking. It doesn't really have to make any sense at all, JP. Which is kind of the Red Bull thing. It's almost nonsensical, but in a way, that's why it works. Because it was really just a new modern 1990s energy drink, right? It was the first one, right? So it was had to convince people that no, there's a new category of soft drink. It's called an energy drink, and you will only drink Red Bull, and it will give you wings, and blah blah blah. But they did that not by just throwing it in a grocery store. Thank God. They did it at nightclubs. That's how that brand entered the U.S. So they used ritualistic insertion brilliantly as a well-heeled global company, and they entered the U.S. fairly slowly in the first couple of years because they needed to seed this thing as a kind of a status item in the nightclub circuit, and that's what they did really well. So they made it a cocktail chaser, right? And that's still going on. It's still a mainstream thing in American bars, right? It's on menus, for God's sakes. But that's where they started, and it was a really brilliant way to create a new category because in consumer culture, I don't know if Grant McCracken would agree or not, but I think in consumer culture, you need to invent new categories in ritualistic social settings, right? Hummus, for example, didn't take off until it became a major party thing in New York and LA, right?
Right.
Um, it was just a
and
weird
and
Israeli specialty food.
right. This reminds me of people like Douglas Holt observing that many of these successful brands follow what he calls a cultural strategy. They discover a cultural trend from teetotaling and dawn parties, daybreaker parties, I think they're called, to others. And he says you need to surf. To allude to your wave, you need to surf that wave. You need to skate that ramp, I guess, in your context.
Yeah.
I want to get to another aspect in your book, which is a little bit more contested, which is you think that repeat buyers and loyalty, I guess many marketers call it, is very important. We've had Byron Sharp on this show before, and he says that's all crap. You should focus totally on reach and trial. So I want to hear your response, but first we'll have a few messages by the conference board, and we'll see you on the other side.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
All right. Hello and welcome back to our conversation with James Richardson about his new book, Ramping Your Brand. And before the break, we were talking about Byron Sharp, who might or might not have read your book yet. But if he did, he probably would disapprove because he thinks that loyalty and repeat purchase misguides a brand and that new trial is king. What do you say to the imaginary comments by Byron Sharp?
So I respect the work. I respect the work of marketing scientists in general. I think actually I think our work is more complementary than it appears on the surface. Although I do have one chapter he probably won't like about the conversion funnel. But here's where I stand on this. And remember, I've done strategic planning advisory work for flat brands that need growth that are $2 billion. So I understand who he wrote his book for and who he does his research for as well. And I think that when I talk about repeat, and I really talk about that more than loyalty, I actually agree with Byron that loyalty is totally oversold, especially if you're talking about fantasy type loyalty like lifetime consumption. None of that's necessary to grow exponentially. You don't need individuals to be lifetime consumers to exponentially grow a startup brand. It's not necessary at all. So I agree with him there. But the problem is that Byron and I are talking about totally different ends of the scale continuum. That's what I believe. So I think the perspectives are somewhat complementary. I can tell you from measuring it myself, painstakingly, because I have to do it client by client and brand by brand, that repeat purchase is insanely high in well-designed premium businesses. It's on an annualized basis, 50, 75, 80%, if it's any good. On a quarterly basis, it'll obviously be lower. But, I think on the typical annual model, it's crazy high. And if you don't have that, and I've had clients who've launched and they measured 10% for something that costs 2x, that's a business in deep doo-doo, right? That's a problematic proposition that needs to be redesigned. There's something fundamentally flawed.
Right.
And so I talk about repeat purchase as it's critical to turn on the engine of the business. And part of turning on that, getting that alternator to flip, is repeat purchase. I don't disagree with him that you can't just sit there and fanatically obsess about it and try to get it to 90% or 90. That's ridiculous, right? But in the beginning, a very clear sign of a healthy premium price startup is that you've got those fans who are driving 90% of the revenue early on in the early years, and they're probably 50 to 60% of your consumer base. That will change, and by the time you get to 8 figures, which is where his model tends to prove itself out. But every time I've measured it by JP, it's still like 2 to 3 times the repeat rate of a major legacy brand. so there's just something different about these premium brands in the structure of the engagement with the consumer. That's all that I talk about in the book, is because I'm using that as a benchmark for something, a standard you want to keep hitting. I think once you get to, and I've talked to people who used to work as general managers at Mars, for example, and I know Byron does a lot of work with them, but they will agree that, once you get to $100 million or $500 million, especially in categories that have no structural growth in them, like candy, wasting your time on repeat purchase is crazy. You need to be focusing on how much impulse trial you can generate. So, we disagree a little bit, but I think it's more about where you are in the growth curve.
Right. It sounds to me a little bit like a discussion between, fund and fund managers who specialize in small cap versus large cap.
Yep.
They're both in investing, but it's different. It's different animals, and they develop in different ways. But it seems to me also that particularly large companies will have to learn even more to be ambidextrous and work both kind of models, because when you look at the balance sheets and you look at what they celebrate, let's say Clorox more recently, they celebrate often the small brands like the Burt's Bees generating the growth. They might not generate the scale yet, but they're very proud of the growth, and growth is needed not only for the financial numbers, but even to attract talent, to make an organization still look young and sexy and dynamic. I think that's something also that Coca-Cola found, with its ventures. So interesting. Maybe we'll bring you back together with Byron and have a little discussion. That would sound like fun. We are running out of time, but I wanted to ask you one question that I asked all our listeners, and I feel like it's going to be an interesting answer, which is, when you look at books and research and insights for inspiration, where are you looking, particularly in the anthropology kind of arena, which might not be the most read area among marketers? What should we look out for? What is some interesting reading there?
Unfortunately, my colleagues aren't really the ones producing that content these days. There are some older classic books in sociology, though, that I do recommend people take a look at, because they drove a lot of my thinking, and they're kind of evergreen. The first one that, as a marketer, I think everyone should be reading at if they're not teaching it at Kellogg, I'd be kind of disappointed at this point. But Irving Goffman was a famous social psychologist in the 50s and 60s, and his book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, albeit somewhat dry at times, is actually pretty gripping narrative of, to the extent to which we craft our social interactions, even at home, to create impressions and to tell stories, right, about who we want, how we want to be perceived. And I think for those that see social scientists like me as sort of annoying cynics who point out the fact that we talk about sustainability and when they don't purchase against it, yada, 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 he's a great voice, I think, to really come to appreciate the extent to which we perform our lives every minute, to a large extent, except when we're in the shower. And that once you begin to appreciate that as a marketer, things that I talked about earlier, like inserting a brand into ritualistic settings, they become easier to see the immense power, of doing that. When your brand can be part of someone's impression management in a group setting, you have a real potential to accelerate velocities, right? And whether it's trial or repeat, who cares? It'll have the same effect. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. I might have a book that you would like, which this reminds me of a little bit. There is a book called Spent by Geoffrey Miller. He's an
Ah,
evolutionary psychologist. And
okay.
he's also written a book called The Mating Mind. So you see where this goes, okay? And Spent's subtitle is Sex Evolution and Consumer Behavior. And it's interesting
Mm,
how he talks about what we project onto brands in terms of what they might do for us in terms of making us look more seductive and attractive, particularly to the other sex, and how marketers also leverage that feeling and perception that we have. So here we go with some interesting books, some interesting reading. Hey, we're definitely out of time. I want to thank you a lot, James, for coming on our show with your book, Ramping Your Brand. If listeners want to know more about it, what's the easiest way for them to get in touch and get informed?
So everybody's welcome to contact me directly at my email. No problem with that, at james@premiumgrowthsolutions.com, which has the domain name. Then go to the website. If you want to check out the book, go to rampingyourbrand.com. There's some testimonials and some other material there, and a crazy video from me. So, but yeah, I would love to get feedback from folks on the book. Hope they enjoy it.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, that's a good teaser. And you, dear listener, if you liked this show and this episode, then check out all the others. There's Off the Shelf and Influencers and many more at conference-board.org. Don't be shy. Ask your friends, neighbors, peers, children to like us and subscribe to us. And I hope we'll see you again on one of these shows. And with that, I say thanks again, James, and goodbye.